My name is Tanisha Legault Washington. I'm the interim director of UTEP, Chicago's Urban Teacher Education Program, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of professional development sessions we are hosting for teachers. We are excited to have you today. We had over 200 teachers signed up to participate in our workshop, which is phenomenal and really speaks to the commitment of teachers to their continued learning and growth. These sessions really came about while thinking about teaching in the midst of uncertainty and the increased complexities that have now presented themselves. These past few months have definitely tested us. The world has changed right before our eyes, and the already difficult and complex job of teaching has been transformed. We are at a point where many of our values and beliefs are being tested. We are in the midst of a global viral pandemic, along with long-standing racial disparity and inequities in our country being brought to the forefront. There is no more important time to be a teacher, to help our youth navigate the present day reality and to provide a foundation of hope and empowerment for them and their ability to lead us in the future. Teachers are essential during this time. I'm honored to have the panelists that are joining us today to share their expertise and wisdom in several areas. Today's session will focus on self-care, as we must begin with the focus on self before we can begin to help others. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders. One, we want to let everyone know that this is a recorded session. It's meant to be shared so that if there are teachers that could not be present today, they could still have access to the information. This training will be posted online in the near future. Also, for those educators that are seeking CPDUs for today's attendance, there will be a link in the chat towards the end of the training where you will fill out your evaluation form, and that will include your email address. After completing that, the certificate of completion will be sent to you for your records. Also, attendees can elect closed captioning feature by clicking on the icon on the gray bar at the bottom of the screen. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the members of our planning team for helping to put this together. Our Dean, Deborah Gorman-Smith, who led the charge in creating this opportunity for professional learning. Adrian Talbot, who has been our point person for all of this. Dwayne Davis, Maggie Walsh, Sharna Epstein, and Carmela Snook, who is in charge of our technology today. A big thank you to all of the team, and a big thank you to our presenters. I also want to thank and acknowledge the Stone Foundation, who is funding this initiative so that this training could be offered to teachers free of charge. With no further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Mashiri Keels, who will begin this session for us.
I can unmute. Thank you. So hi, very happy to be here with you today. And I will be talking with you just for about 15 minutes just to get started. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Joel Jackson, who works in University of Chicago hospitals and will be really helpful with you guys for setting a self-care plan. So I'm an associate professor in comparative human development and the director of the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project. And before we go any further, I just want to say that I can explain to you completely what happened with the technology and why things went haywire. It's because about 2 weeks ago, Joel and Carmela asked if I wanted to do a test run. And I said, nope, not needed, don't have to do it, nothing like that, because we're on Zoom every day, all day. And because I said, no, we're good, universe decided to make sure to show, not today. So, you know, just going with it, as we all are, but just, you know, that important part. And I'm sure you guys all know at this point, having done this the past several months, that whenever anything can go wrong, it's going to go wrong right at that critical moment. And so I find the best way to do it, to deal with it, is to kind of just say, hey, we are all here together and we're going to work through it together. So with that, that's how I manage stress. I'm like, let's share in the stress, which will be good because I'm going to end with like talking about collective care as a way for you guys to think about how to move, how to engage in self-care, which is really critical, but then how to also do that kind of thing, which is we are all in this together, that were really, really helpful in order to be able to get through this year and who knows how much longer, but just that like we're all in this together. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and just for about 15 minutes, set up just some ways to think about the professional stress as an educator, school social worker, psychologist, counselor, whatever your position may be, administrator in a school. Just what is this collective stress that we're all managing as educators? And I'm gonna see, yes, I can share my screen. Everything's good with that. So one quick moment. Okay. So stress and self-care. And really all that I want to do in these like 10, 15 minutes, and I'm going to put my timer on to make sure, because it is possible to talk about this for a long time because it's a really big issue, is that it's professional stress. It's an aspect of the job. It doesn't necessarily have to be an aspect of the job. It's always going to be work, and there's always going to be some level of stress, but it does not have to be the stress that can be completely overwhelming, as it is oftentimes now, the way our schools are organized and the way many educators go about doing their work, which is in isolation in their classrooms. But so when we think about the major sources of workplace stress for educators, we have personal resources, which is kind of your teaching capacity. And we're going to talk about some of these things on the next slide. But what are your actual professional resources that you have to draw on when you're working with students? The educational structure. So what are the aspects of how your school might be organized? And these are all kind of things that make it more difficult than it needs to be, is kind of the framing here. The demands of the job and the professional isolation. The professional isolation is a big one. So, make sure it's moving. There we go. So when we think about personal resources, it's the strength of your classroom management skills and your social and emotional competencies. The more skilled educators are with that toolbox of classroom management strategies, the less stress they report being. And the more skilled they are with their social and emotional competencies and being able to teach those in students, the less stress they report. And that's just because both of those things, the higher your capacity in those things, the more you're able to manage proactively the behavioral challenges that come up in the classroom. When we think about the job demands, this is that you're often trying to meet diverse and complex needs of students. It's much easier job if you have students that are all at a very similar level in terms of their academic capacity and their behavioral challenges. There is a continuously increasing workload, and this year it just exploded what the workload was and how you're going to have to manage that workload with your own personal lives and challenges just really collided this year. High stakes testing and other accountability pressures are huge. That's another aspect of the stress the teachers report, and it doesn't need to be that way. Educational structure. So what is the culture in your specific school with regards to the level of collegiality, the amount of collaboration, and the amount of distrust among staff? So are you guys as a staff community in your school kind of all in this together and able to support each other and call on each other for support in meeting the needs of students, support in when you're weak in a particular capacity, you have another staff member that you can go to help with that, and also weak and inconsistent leadership? When that is the case in a school, those factors increase the level of educator stress. And then lastly, professional isolation. So inadequate professional support and lack of autonomy over work. So these two things work together, which is the issue of inadequate professional support. That is, are you being called upon? This year is one of those years to meet students' needs in ways for which you don't have the professional competencies and you don't have an access, a way to develop and gain those competencies so that you can do what you need to do this coming year. And this training series is one of those that's being put together to try to help provide some additional opportunities and resources that will build your professional competencies for the challenge that you're about to meet this coming academic year. And then lack of autonomy over work is just the extent to which you can adapt things for what works for your teaching style and what works for the needs of your student, versus being forced to implement particular strategies and practices that just aren't working for either you or your students. So these are the kind of workplace stressors that educators are managing that are kind of specific to this profession. And it's something just to think about when you think about what are the aspects of my workplace that are making this more challenging for me, and what can I do? How can I work with my colleagues to address any of these? Addressing any one of them will help to reduce some of the stress in your school, in person or remote. So just a quote to take a look at and think about for a moment. And it's just saying essentially that teaching, being an educator, involves emotional labor. It is impossible to work with any group of human beings, this one, students, youth, children. It's impossible to work with any group of human beings and expect them to learn something from you without there being some level of emotional connection and relationship building. And in that relationship building, it's emotional labor. And especially then when you're working with students who themselves are experiencing trauma and chronic stressors in their own lives, because of your relationship with those students, the things that they're experiencing are going to affect you. It is a factor of the work. It's something to understand. And then think about, how do I put practices in place that will help me manage the stress and the emotional labor of this work so that it can be manageable, because it can be manageable. And this one is just a really quick reminder of why it is so important to engage in self-care and to work with your colleagues to set up practices for collective care. And that's because being an educator has educator stressors, the ones that I listed in the green on the previous slides. Those stressors impact you negatively. So they lead to emotional exhaustion, social detachment, heightened sense of fear when you are experiencing secondary traumatization from your students' experiences, anxiety, feelings of helplessness, estrangement from work, alteration or disruption of the processing and responses to experiences, so you become a little bit more detached, as well as physical and psychological ailments. So it can affect every aspect of your well-being. And because teaching is in part done in your relationships with students and your capacity and your interaction and the things that you bring to the classroom and what you are able to share with your students, which involves part of sharing yourself. If you as an educator are stressed and distressed, it's going to be detrimental for the work that you do in your classroom and interactions with students. So it can be detrimental to students because of your decreased professional capacity and effectiveness, your risk of compassion fatigue and burnout, which means you might still be showing up for work, but you're not engaging and you're not bringing your full self to the job. All of those things lead to a decline in student achievement and connectedness to school. And because it's also associated with educators leaving the profession, it results in destabilization of schools, as there's a constant cycle of teachers coming in and leaving. All of that is to say, you have to prioritize your well-being and self-care in order to be the best teacher that you can for your students, or the best educator that you can for your students in whatever role you are in. And I'm not really going to go through these because Joel will talk to you about many of these things, but it's just to say compassion fatigue, one of the ways it's referred to for educators is just cost of caring. So when an educator approaches students with an open heart and a listening ear, it can be difficult to empathize. It can be difficult to still empathize with the children that you work with, because it can be so stressful to hear the things that they're going through, over which you have no control, and that are distressing for you to hear. And because of that, your mind and your brain and your body will begin to protect yourself by starting to distance yourself from students and distance yourself from being open to hearing about what's happening in their lives. If this is not managed, it can lead to secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization, and then over time, burnout. This is just a note. I will let you guys look at some of the words in these circles. Essentially, stress that is not well managed will begin to compromise every aspect of your psychological, emotional, and physical well-being. And some of the vulnerabilities to stress are also fairly specific, not specific, but thinking of them in the ways that might matter for educators. These things matter for everyone, but how do they matter for you as an educator that you need to keep in mind? These factors that can make you more or less vulnerable to the stress and the trauma of working with vulnerable students. So whether you have had a previous traumatic experience can make you much more vulnerable, especially when your students have had that same traumatic experience, because them talking about something in their lives is going to be triggering your memory about things that have happened in your life. So it's important to always keep in check with yourself with what's happening when you might be hearing a difficult story from a student. Having a heightened sense of empathy is great for connecting with your students and understanding what their needs are. It also leaves you vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. Neglect and unawareness of your own social and emotional needs. So oftentimes as educators, we're so focused on the emotional and social aspects of working with our students that we forget our own needs, our own need to be able to have a lunch break away from students, because we need that time to recover and recuperate after being in such close contact and constant emotional interaction with so many students, that it's helpful and it's a good thing when you need to say, I need to have lunch away from students, or I need to have lunch away from the school building so I can come back after lunch and re-engage. Pushing too hard to get things done. We all know we're up late at night, early in the morning in order to get all the quote unquote extra work done. But it's really the work that needs to be done in order to meet the needs of our students. It's important to say sometimes and some days, that work bag is going to stay there, and whatever doesn't get done, doesn't get done. Because again, if you're not well, you're not going to be able to fully show up for your students. Trying to do everything on your own, particularly classroom teachers who are in that space of being by themselves in their classroom all day, and then others expecting it of them, and you expecting it of yourself to be able to do everything on your own. And then lastly, close connection with students or colleagues who have experienced trauma. Part of teaching and working in schools is that there are often 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 students that you develop an especially close relationship with, and that you sometimes learn about adverse situations that they may be in, and may feel the need to cross boundaries in order to save and help those students. That is something that can leave you very open and exposed to secondary traumatic stressors, because oftentimes we can't change what's happening in our students' lives outside of school. And so these are just some of those things to think about in the ways that are very specific to educators when thinking about stress and trauma and how it might affect us. And so what I want to do with that is bring Joel in to the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mashiri, for giving that great background. Actually saved me some time, which is going to be helpful during this moment. I will do my best, everyone, to keep us still at the time boundary by trying to end with at least 5 to 10 minutes left for questions and comments. And again, my name is Joel Jackson. I serve as Assistant Director of Inclusion and Training for UChicago Medicine's Urban Health Initiative, Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. Very happy to be with you all today to discuss compassion, fatigue, resilience. I want to start off by using this quote by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and a survivor of the Holocaust. And as you can see here on the screen, it says, "That which is to give light must endure burning," which means as educators, you have to give of yourself in order for others to learn and for others to grow. At the same time, the purpose of this presentation is to enhance skills for resilience that you can practice on an intrapersonal level so that you don't burn to the wick's end and burn out, as Mashiri described earlier. So the skills that I will go over and we're actually going to practice today. The first is the skill of self-regulation, relaxing the body to relax the mind. The second is the skill of reframing, intentionally changing our perceptions. And the third is self-care, refueling and accessing support. So before I go further, I do want to just explain quickly the definition of compassion fatigue that I work from. As you can see at the top of the screen, it says traumatic stress plus burnout equals compassion fatigue. And when we're talking about traumatic stress, we're talking about all of the different forms of traumatic stress or the forms of trauma that Mashiri alluded to. So everything from historical trauma to acute trauma or chronic trauma when traumas happen one right after the other, or even intergenerational trauma or complex traumas which adverse childhood experiences are part of complex trauma, but so are issues revolving or involving civil unrest. So a lot of what we're experiencing today in our society is also an example of complex trauma. Workplace-induced trauma or system-induced trauma is included in that as well. Most oftentimes, though, when we're in a setting where we are providing care or education, especially when we have students who've had trauma themselves, we tend to experience secondary traumatic stress, which Ms. Shiri explained earlier. The trauma we experience is not directly impacting us, but impacts individuals that we interact with. So that with burnout is what causes compassion fatigue. And burnout, of course, is the chronic state of perceived demands outweighing perceived resources, right? And compassion fatigue, it's important to know that it's not a disease, but it does cause what I call dis-ease within the body. And how we perceive the events within our environment as demands influence whether we think we have the resources to meet those demands. And often the effect of compassion fatigue is gradual and it's hard to recognize. It's easier for me to recognize it in someone else than it is for me to recognize in myself. Think of the analogy of a frog in a pot of water. If you put a frog in a boiling pot of water, it's going to hop out because it's going to know the temperature is too high. But if you put a frog in a pot of water on the stove and it's lukewarm, it'll rest in that pot. And if you turn the temperature up gradually over time, the frog won't realize the increase in the temperature, and it'll allow itself to sit there even to the point where it boils. That's an analogy that I like to use to explain sort of the gradual effects of compassion fatigue and how it takes time for it to result in some of the sympathetic arousal symptoms, which, as you can see here in bullet number 2, these are the same symptoms that we experience when we are in our fight or flight response, right? We have increased adrenaline, we have a fast heart rate, muscle tension, breathing fast, or feeling scared or keyed up or vigilant, right? And that can make it hard for us to think clearly. So the first and most important step will always be self-regulation. It's also important to understand that this is all very normal. All of us experience this at some point during our careers, and our ability to help each other is the main tool that we will have in these difficult times. So Ms. Shiri briefly went over some of the effects of compassion fatigue, but here you can see in this grid the physiological impact, the brain mechanic effects, as well as other effects. Notice in the physiological space, like I said earlier, it causes us to have muscle tension, increased breathing rate, increased heart rate, decreased breathing volume, centralized circulation in terms of our bloodstream and how it flows. It doesn't flow as good as it should when we're in a state of perceived threat, and it causes this dis-ease. In terms of brain mechanics, because we are challenged, we're in our defensive threat response or our fight or flight response. And what that does to the brain, it causes us to have this sort of heightened sense of vigilance, increased basal ganglia and thalamic functioning, so it causes us to have anxiety. But then look what else it does. It decreases our neocortical functioning within our frontal lobe and our temporal lobe, which controls our language and speech. So the part of my brain that helps me to think of consequences of my actions, that helps me to problem solve, that helps me to empathize and tap into compassion, all of that decreases when I'm operating out of my perceived threat or threat response. It also can increase obsession and compulsion, decrease speed and agility and strength, and can cause us to have constricted thoughts and behaviors, ultimately experiencing fatigue. Well, when we practice the skill of self-regulation, what we're actually doing is moving from what's called a sympathetic dominant nervous system to a parasympathetic dominant nervous system, meaning we move from our fight or flight response and within seconds regain that neocortical functioning. So look at how our bodies are impacted when we practice self-regulation even after perceiving a threat. Physiologically, we have a stabilized heart rate, stable breathing, balanced circulation within our bloodstream, relaxed muscles, balanced energy, comfort in our own bodies. And because we're not operating out of the threat response, we have increased neocortical functioning, frontal lobe activity, increased temporal lobe activity. and have appropriate anterior cingulate cortex functioning. It also increases our ability to be creative. We can be more transformative as leaders and educators and less coercive. We can be more intentional about our behavior, have increased motor control, strength, speed, and agility, pro-social behaviors, and resilience. So we're more proactive and less reactive. It helps us to master our experiences and skills, and we have more sustained energy, and we're not feeling fatigued. So now what I'd like to do is, I would like for us to practice some of these skills. For the first part of self-regulation, let's practice diaphragmatic breathing. I invite you to sit comfortably in your chair, plant your feet firmly on the floor, and take one of your hands and identify your diaphragm by placing your hand below your rib cage. And take your other hand and put it on your chest. And try to become mindful of your breathing. And I ask that you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And as you do this, you should feel your diaphragm, your stomach, your belly rising and falling. So what I'm going to ask you to do is breathe in through your nose for 3 seconds, and then breathe out through your mouth for 5 seconds, and have pursed lips as you breathe out. And we're going to practice this about 5 different times, all right? So let's first begin. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, and out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth with pursed lips. Breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. One more time. Breathe in and out. Good job. Now, think about how you felt before you practiced this diaphragmatic breathing and how you feel now. Hopefully your body feels much more relaxed than you did before we did this activity. In addition, if you find that you don't have the time to actually practice diaphragmatic breathing, notice it only took a few seconds for us to do, so hopefully you can find time to do it. Another thing that you can do is, if you look at the images that are on your screen, these pictures and the way the posture of the individuals, that actually helps to also emulate diaphragmatic breathing. So let's say you're just walking down the hall, or if you're still at home even, and you're walking from one room to the next. Try just locking your hands and putting them behind your head. And you'll notice that that aids you in diaphragmatic breathing as well. Another skill, or part of skill number 1 that you can do for self-regulation, is doing a body scan. A full body scan, paying attention to your muscles from head to toe, okay? So what I'm going to invite you to do, and I'll walk you through it, do a quick body scan from head to toe, and don't forget your back. Again, sitting, comfortably in your seats with your feet firmly placed on the floor. Maybe let your hands rest on your lap. And start with the head. Relax all the muscles in your face, from your forehead to your brow, to your cheekbones and your jawline, allowing your tongue to fall from the roof of your mouth to rest snugly at the floor of your mouth. And now move to the neck. You may need to roll your neck around just a bit to identify if there's any tension, and just try to relax those muscles. Down to your shoulders. We tend to hold a lot of tension in our shoulders. Roll your shoulders forward, maybe roll your shoulders back, and then just allow your shoulders to rest and let them just sort of just sink to the sides of your body. Don't forget to keep your arms relaxed. As your hands maybe rest on your knees, you may need to clench your fists and release them and put them back so that you can have relaxed muscles in your arms and your hands. And let's do the upper body. So first, relaxing all the muscles in the front of your body, going down from your chest to your belly. And if you're like me and you like to hold your belly muscles in, just let them go. Let them release. Relaxing also all the muscles in your back, following your spinal cord, from your neck all the way down to your pelvic floor. And relax all of the muscles in your pelvic area as well. Just allowing your pelvic area to sort of just expand. And so you kind of sink into your seat. Relaxing your legs from your thighs down to your knees, your calf muscles down to your ankles and your feet and your toes. And for 5 seconds, I want you to become like a wet noodle and just rest there. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, think about how you felt before we practiced self-regulation and how you feel now. You may have had some intrusive thoughts while we were doing these exercises, and that's fine as well because that's perfectly normal. Hopefully now you have more focused thoughts and you can focus more intently on the presentation and the things that I'm saying. Let's move now. Well, before we move to skill number 2, just wanted to share this. The idea is that we move from having our minds filled with a lot of clutter to being more mindful and having more space within our brains to clearly think. So skill number 2 is called reframe. We're going to reframe, and it means intentionally changing the perception. This is about being mission driven and leading from your mission. And it's about also not responding to the environment in a way that makes us reactive and moving from having an external locus of control to more of an internal locus of control. By doing that, we can see how we choose to move forward and we choose to continue to do the work that we're doing from a principle base. So that we're not demand-based driven, but we're principle-based driven. This also means having somewhat of a tolerance of pain for growth, meaning that I'm choosing to continue to do things even though I may experience challenges, and that those challenges will only help me to grow. It also means maturation of spirituality. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily speaking about religious spirituality, that's included. But really, when I say maturation of spirituality, I'm thinking more of connection to something greater than I am. And if you look at the image on this screen, it says, do I go where I aim myself? That's what reframing is all about. So there's this quote from Wayne Dyer that says, change the way you look at things and the things you look at change. There's an energizer that I like to do to help me think about changing my perception. If you would just indulge me for a moment and take one finger and point it in the air, put it like right above your head, and look up and start making a clockwise circle. Continue to make the circle as you look up. Now bring your finger down to eye level as you continue to make the circle. Now bring the finger down now to maybe chest level and continue to make the circle. If you look down, the circle should now be going in a counterclockwise motion instead of clockwise. That can help you with energizing yourself and also changing your perception. It's important to remember that we're all just trying to be loyal to our values and our own moral code, even when we cannot control the outcomes. The fact is that we don't control the outcomes of our work because there are too many factors that play into the outcomes. What we control is our process by which we move forward to do our work. Sometimes we experience stress, which is very normal, and this stress can cause conflict with our principles and our values and can create a sense of less power or independence. Well, reframing in maturing our perceptions can help us change from reacting to what is outside of ourselves to what is inside, and responding to the stress in a way that is in line with our values and our moral code. Remember that we're all living according to our own values and that we're doing the very best that we can to be the best versions of ourselves each day. So the first activity on the skill number 2 of reframing, we call it the Dear Supervisor email or text. At any point throughout your day, you can write yourself a note on a piece of paper or a Post-it and fold it and put it in your pocket. Send yourself an email or a text message through your phone as if you were your own great supervisor, that ideal supervisor that sees and notices all of the good things that you did today, all of the good things that you do normally in your role, and gives you praise for it. What I invite you to do is think of at least 2 effective things that you do normally within your role, or if you're in your role at work, think of the 2 things that you did that day, and allow that great supervisor within you to give yourself credit for each. At that moment, you can send yourself an email or a text, but what I want to do is invite you right now to share in the chat box perhaps 2 things that you do within your role that makes you proud, 2 things that you're happy that you get the opportunity to do. I'm going to give you 1 minute to put this in the chat box. You may begin now. Take about 20 more seconds. Thank you, everyone. If you're still typing, that's completely fine. Continue to type until you're finished making your statement. We're just going to move forward for the sake of time. Another activity that you can practice for skill number 2 on reframing, we call this practice your promise to yourself. It's important for you to think about and remember what are the reasons that you decided to become an educator, or what are the reasons that you decided to join or take up the role that you have in education. You may want to start off with one of these stems. I promise myself to live, to work, to continue, to love, to be, to become, to believe, to promote, to strive, or to seek. It's about tapping back into that energy that we had when we first got into our roles. And it's about remembering these promises that we made and continue to refuel ourselves and prevent ourselves from burning out. It's about self-validation and doing what it is that you like to do within your role. So again, I'm going to give you 1 minute to maybe type in what is one promise that you made to yourself. And as you type it, I want you to think about how you feel. And as you read the promises that others have made to themselves, think about how you feel. Again, you will have 1 minute and you may begin now. These are some great promises, everyone. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, thank you for participating in that. I appreciated a lot of the promises that you all made. Some of them are about your students and the environment in which you work, and some of them are personal, like practicing self-care. And I think that all of them are important. What you're actually doing is writing your personal sort of covenant. that promise that you made to yourself. And I encourage you to continue to write it, right? Because we have many promises that we made to ourselves in terms of why we decided to become educators, you know, and so the longer it gets, the better it is in terms of continuing to remember and practice your personal covenant. So skill number 3 is focused on self-care, refueling and accessing support. Because even though we're in an educational setting, we're also very much caregivers. You know, parents and guardians have put their children within our care for the time that they're in our classrooms. And we can't do very well taking care of others if we're not doing well to take care of ourselves. So we have to refuel so that we have the energy to meet the demands of the day. Part of that is developing and utilizing a support network by empowering a select few people to confront you when you become symptomatic. And it's also the ability to safely unload and decrease denial by sharing what you're going through with someone else. This helps to create a sense of community, and we get the support that we need while we can give support as well. So the first part of skill number 3, self-care, refueling, and accessing support, we call it dare to trust, social self-care. What I want you to do is think of at least one other person, maybe up to 3 individuals that you have in your life, perhaps in education or in a similar role that you have, and ask those individuals if they could serve as backup support. Think about who they are and how you'll contact them. And when you speak to them, you'll want to tell them how they can support you. And you should also keep in mind that this relationship is reciprocal, meaning that you'll be there to support them as well. The idea is for us to provide space for each other as we build a safety net or care network for ourselves. Listen to each other as we unload. Thank each other for listening, and try not to offer fixes, because the idea is that we're not broken, but we're just full and need to unload. Another part of skill number 3, self-care, is personal self-care. At any point, again, you can make a list of 2 or 3 things that you can do for refueling and commit to doing them on an everyday basis. These activities should be both creative and they should require some level of energy. So they should be, dynamic. You can make this list, and some examples could be for perhaps calling a partner to hear "I love you," or humming your favorite song. It could also mean looking at a picture of a family member, a friend, or a child, or seeing the beauty of something that we take for granted, like the leaves on the trees, or mindful breathing, or eating something tasty, or going outside to feel the warmth of the sun. So at this point, I invite you to share what are some things that you do or that you want to start doing to practice self-care and personally refuel yourselves. I'll give you 1 minute to share this brainstorm in the chat box, and you may see some things people put in there that you want to start practicing yourself. You may begin now. Take about 20 more seconds. These are some great ideas, everyone. Okay, great job. I'm going to steal some of these ideas. So I just want to wrap it up by encouraging you to continue to think of different ways that you can nourish yourself, to refuel yourself. Every time that you eat, for example, is an opportunity to nourish your body. So be mindful of what you are putting inside your body to give yourself more energy. It's also important for us to get sleep, taking care of ourselves and getting good sleep, meaning try to sleep without having a television set on in your room, or try to sleep and have your phone turned off or on silent so that it doesn't ding or ring or you get notifications that wake you up in the middle of the night. You know, sometimes we sleep through the night, but there are things in our environment that still cause us to have a restless sort of sleep. So I encourage you to think about and be mindful of how you're sleeping. It's also important to take breaks. You know, befriend your body by doing some things to exercise. Maybe if you have a building where you have elevators, you take the stairs instead of the elevator. And try to slow down so that your mind isn't so filled with clutter and you can be more intentional and focused by relaxing and, of course, practicing self-regulation. The idea is to remain grateful. Try to find beauty and opportunities to make us smile. Some tactics that I use, you can name one new thing you feel grateful for each day. And they don't have to be real big things. You could be grateful for the sun, or you could be grateful for driving and having exit ramps on the highway, you know, whatever it is that you come up with. You could also think of something that has brought you a sense of joy, you know, whether that's a hobby or something that you do with work, or perhaps even something that you do with your family or your children, if you're a parent. You can also ask yourself, who do you love that you can reach out to today? Or think, what made you laugh today or yesterday or even last week? And I started with Viktor Frankl, and I'll sort of end with a quote from him as well. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Just want to say thank you for attending and give a quick pause in case anyone has any questions or comments. And if you think of questions or comments later after the presentation is done, feel free to send an email to this email address, and I will respond as soon as I get them. And you can either ask questions in the chat box, or you can come off of mute and ask your questions verbally, or you may not have a question, you may have a comment. But the Zoom is open.
Well, this was absolutely wonderful as far as all the tactics, the information. At first, I was like frazzled and frustrated and stressed, and I just feel so at ease with all of this information that you, all of you all shared today. So thank you so much. It was very rich.
You're absolutely welcome. I'm glad it had a great impact. And keep in mind that these are things that you can practice all the time throughout your day, and you can share these skills with others, you know. And so what we'll be doing is sort of building resilience for ourselves within our own profession, especially as we share these skills with others. You are welcome, everyone. You're so very welcome. I didn't get a chance to pay close attention to the chat box. If in case someone asked a question, please let me know.